Adi Ignatius. I'm currently the editor-in-chief of the Harvard Business Review. And maybe more relevantly, I was the Wall Street Journal's bureau chief in China 20 years ago during the Tiananmen era. I mean, I was lucky enough to have gotten on one of the first commercial tours of China after Carter normalized relations with Beijing in the late 70s. And, I had about 6 months to prepare, and I was thinking, we all felt like Marco Polo back then. I mean, now it's commonplace, but that was a big deal then. So I just thought, how do I prepare? And I started taking Chinese lessons, and I just absolutely fell in love with Chinese, then with China when I made the trip, and pretty much my career path was forged. As soon as I graduated from college, I went out to Hong Kong, worked for a magazine there, and within a few years was the Wall Street Journal's bureau chief in Beijing. So that was really my passion in those years. Yeah, the Zhao memoir project, it's interesting. It was a tightly held secret among just a very, very few of us for more than a year. And the person who brought me into it was my co-editor and co-producer in the project, Bao Pu. Now, Bao Pu is a very interesting figure. He's the son of a very important person in kind of modern Chinese politics, Bao Tong. Bao Tong was Zhao Ziyang's primary aide. And after the Tiananmen crackdown, after the killings, June 4th, 1989, Zhao, the Communist Party secretary, was put under house arrest, where he remained for the last 16 years of his life before he died in 2005. Bao Tong, his aide, actually was sent to prison and was under solitary confinement for many of the 7 years that he was away. So his son Bao Pu is in Hong Kong, and he's a U.S. passport holder. But Bao Pu became the person who was entrusted with making this project happen. Zhao, before he died, secretly, under house arrest, secretly under the nose of his captors, recorded 30 hours of tape that was his secret journal about what really happened behind the scenes during Tiananmen, how the Politburo really interacted with one another, how he tried to stop the crackdown and lost the argument and lost his job for it. So he recorded these 30 hours of tape. He entrusted a few people to smuggle them out of the country. They eventually made it to Hong Kong, where Bao Pu was entrusted with sort of getting it all together and making this project happen. He needed somebody like me. He needed a Western journalist who could help polish the language, who could write introductions that would create context for American readers in particular who don't know all this Chinese history, to write an introduction, to find a publisher. So he brought me into this about a year and a half ago, and we had to keep it secret because we had a fear that if the Chinese government knew about this, they would squeeze Zhao's children, most of whom are still in China and are doing business. They would squeeze them and just say, do whatever you can to stop this project, and that probably would have succeeded. So somehow we managed to keep this a very tightly held secret until publication. After the crackdown in 1989, the Chinese government has sort of spun its version of events. What really happened? What was that movement all about? And this is 20 years ago. This is a whole generation. So there a lot of young Chinese people who don't really know the truth about what happened then. And the truth, as Zhao describes it, is this was not a protest movement that threatened the state, that threatened order. In fact, it was almost entirely peaceful. That the people who participated, they had various reasons for taking part, but they were idealistic. The government. What Zhao's book makes clear is there was somebody at the highest levels, in fact, the highest level, who really saw another way, who really saw that we did not need to crack down on this movement, that there was an energy that was about making China a better place, helping China's reforms continue. And people in China don't realize that. The line that they're fed now is that there was a rebellion, there were some bad people who were manipulating it, it had to be put down. Any reasonable government would do the same thing if there was a rebellion in their capital. And the truth is that there wasn't a rebellion until the government sent troops in and brought everybody in Beijing out on the streets in a kind of state of agitated concern. And at that point they had something. They had a lot of people who were fighting them, and they shot their way through the city and shot their way into Tiananmen Square. So I think it's important to tell the truth about what happened at Tiananmen. But more importantly, Zhao talks about the need in China for, for a democratic system. What he talks about is a kind of Western parliamentary system. This is then no longer about history. This then enters the dialogue that concerned Chinese people are having all the time about what is the future of China? What does China need to be? The deal that the government is offering them is we will let you get rich, but we will not give you any political freedom. And if you challenge the state, if you challenge the Communist Party, you may be arrested, you may be disappeared. So I think what this book is showing is that at this high level, there are people who are thinking about another way, and where political freedom can not only assist in economic development, but is valuable for society in its own right. And that through this book, this line of thinking from an interesting person forgotten until now is now entering the dialogue. And who knows how it will affect that dialogue. Zhao, one of the reasons that things got worse, I think, is when the student movement really broke out. Zhao was in North Korea. There was a long-standing state visit. He felt he couldn't cancel it. So he was kind of out of the decision-making at a very crucial point. And this movement would have, I think, died out pretty quickly. But when students first started to march, remember, they started to march after the death of Hu Yaobang, who had been party general secretary until being purged a couple years earlier. And Hu Yaobang wasn't the most charismatic figure in the world, but he was a relative liberal. He was sort of real. He had a heart that a lot of these Communist Party officials sort of don't show. And so when he died, the students used him as a symbol to kind of express their discontent with a lot of things, including a general level of political freedom. I really think this would have died down relatively quickly had the government not made a very unfortunate decision of printing a very scary editorial in the official mouthpiece, People's Daily, that branded this student movement as unpatriotic, as counter-revolutionary, terms that are very charged in China. And we're basically telling these students who felt idealistic, who felt that they were keeping up a tradition of marching and protesting in the interests of Chinese society. It had the effect, it was very disappointing and was taken as a challenge. And so the day after this editorial, which was meant to intimidate them and get this thing over with, the day after, suddenly everything escalated, and the biggest protest to date erupted the next day. And so when Zhao came back from North Korea, he was basically saying, look, it was this editorial that made things worse. Let's back away from it. Let's find a way from it. I'll even take responsibility for it. So it was my mistake, but we need to back away from this because it's clearly made things worse. Now here you have a problem with a non-modern political system. Basically, the editorial represented Deng Xiaoping's thinking. Deng was the supreme leader of China then. He didn't even have a title, but everybody knew he was the leader. So there was a sense, if you back down from this editorial, Deng Xiaoping will lose face. Well, that argument played out all the way to the end, where rather than have this octogenarian lose face, it's better to unleash the troops, send the tanks into Tiananmen Square, kill hundreds of people, because the alternative would be a loss of face. I'm simplifying a little bit, but in a sense, that was where the battle lines were drawn internally, and where Zhao thought we can back down and let me even take the fall for this, and where the party wouldn't allow that to happen. Initially, we all called the protests sort of pro-democracy protests. It was kind of an easy shorthand. There was kind of a backlash, I think, in analysis of it, and people said, well, it wasn't about democracy, and these kids didn't know what they wanted, and people were out there for various reasons. I think that misses the point. Basically, they were out there because they didn't like the system. It's not unlike the protests in Iran right now. Do people want to overthrow the state? Do they know what they want as an alternative? Not necessarily, but they know they're not happy with the way this election's gone, with the state of things. And to me, that's essentially a democracy movement, that people are saying, we want a better system, we want a better political system. So Um, so, you know, it was a little bit chaotic. People were talking about democracy. They were talking about fighting corruption. They were talking about sort of smaller concerns that they had. But, you know, I think Zhao did understand the kind of mixed message. You know, he thought there was a way to take a softer line, to compromise, and to essentially harness this energy for the good of China and not to view it as a threat to the state. You know, the turning point was you know, the hardliners wanted to basically bring in the army to clear the protesters, and Zhao just said, "I can't do that." And that's you know, in a communist state, you can have vigorous debate behind the scenes, but the sort of process, the idea of democratic centralism, once there's a decision, everybody sort of lines up and supports it. Zhao just said, "I can't do that. I'm not going to be the general secretary who authorizes lethal force against this protest movement." And at that point, he was out. And you know, that was maybe 2 weeks before the Tiananmen Massacre actually happened. But you know, he just refused to go along, and that was it for him. That was it for his career. And the die was cast. The army was going to come in. It was just a question of when. I think everyone, I mean, the memory of what happened 20 years ago, I think people all around the world, I mean, they were caught up in the idealism. You know, CNN, it was one of the first things CNN was sort of broadcasting daily into our homes, you know, from their, they were broadcasting live from Tiananmen Square when they were able to at first, and it really captured the imagination. But I think even overseas in people's minds, I think people forget whether the crackdown eventually was justified, had it gotten out of control, had it become violent, was the state not functioning because of it. And I think the book makes it clear that this is a peaceful demonstration, an idealistic peaceful demonstration that could have been handled better. And more than that, what you realize from the book is that the debate then is still the debate now. I mean, this is 20 years ago, but essentially it's the same China. That yes, you've had economic liberalization, it's been successful, but political reform has to follow for a healthy society. And that was the debate then, and Zhao was a relative liberal in that debate. He lost. That's still unresolved, and that it's not going to just disappear. It's gonna bubble up from time to time. And I actually think this book and Zhao's argument will now become part of that discussion. Zhao, again, he spent those last 16 years out of house arrest, out of the public eye, and in many ways is a forgotten character, you know, in China, certainly in the world, and even in China. And it's unfortunate for a couple of reasons. One, I mean, he was the true implementer of the kind of post-Mao economic innovations that really, you know, we think of China now as this economic juggernaut. Well, Zhao is the guy who started all that. And he started that when he was, before he came to Beijing in a senior role, when he was a leader in the provinces, in Sichuan province and in Guangdong province, just trying new capitalist-style, market-style innovations to sort of get China out of the sort of collectivist, inefficient, kind of post-Maoist stagnation that they were in. So he succeeded so well that he was brought to Beijing at a you know, by Chinese standards, very young age. Became premier before he was party secretary. And as premier, you know, Deng Xiaoping is credited with sort of creating the blueprint for modern China. But Deng didn't have details. Deng said, I want a liberal economy, I want a booming economy, I want people to get rich. I don't want any threat to the Communist Party, but I'm willing to let people get rich. And he basically said, Zhao, you figure that out. So the details were up to Zhao, and more importantly, the internal struggles. I mean, you know, the government, probably now, but especially then, was balanced between people who were reformers and people who were conservatives. So Zhao had to fight those struggles. Any kind of economic liberalization, whether it was you know, letting peasants sell extra grain to make money, whether it was, you know, taking controls off prices, just all these steps toward a market economy. Zhao had huge opposition, and paid for it every step along the way. And you know, the fact that reforms sort of got started in his era was due to very skillful infighting that Deng sometimes interceded and helped him, and sometimes he just was out there fighting the fight. And people should know that. I mean, this guy made a great accomplishment, great contribution toward this kind of economic juggernaut that China is today. Zhao believed in political reform to the extent that it would help develop the economy. And I actually was the only Western journalist in the late 80s to meet with Baotong, his top political aide. And he just didn't give interviews. And, I had a high-level delegation in from New York. I was the Wall Street Journal's bureau chief then. And we met with him. And he was the guy who we'd heard was the most liberal thinker in terms of political reform. And we talked to him, and he sounded very conservative. He said, well, political reform is great if it helps boost the economy, but for its own sake, we don't really see a value in that. Well, it was interesting. I later talked to a mutual friend who knew Baotong and whom I knew, and he said he'd gone to Baotong after that interview was published in the Wall Street Journal and wondered if Baotong might get in trouble for sort of speaking up with the Western press, and Baotong told him, no, it's great. It made me sound really conservative. And that's kind of the game they had to play. If they were going to push the envelope, they didn't want to do it in such a way that it would alarm the hardliners who would then step in and crack down. So they were moving at a very gradual pace. But I think particularly later in his life, particularly under house arrest during those years of thinking and reflecting, Zhao really went further and realized that to get past the problems of corruption, to get society to kind of a normal, productive state, you had to have political reform. And again, that's where he came down finally saying, what China needs is a Western parliamentary system. It can't succeed if it remains a one-party state the way it is now. The other incredible thing about the book is it's the first time anyone has peeled back the curtain to kind of show how these top officials, how the Politburo Standing Committee, how they all interact with one another. And it's incredible. It's terrifying in some ways. I mean, we knew there was factionalism. We knew there were liberals and conservatives. We knew they didn't agree on things. Zhao really makes it clear, not only did they kind of openly disagree with each other, but they were like school children at times. Zhao's chief rival was probably Premier Li Peng, who was really sort of out there in terms of declaring martial law and being a force behind the crackdown. But at a point when Li Peng was suspicious of Zhao, when Zhao would go out in public, Li Peng would tail him and jump out in front of him, in front of the photographers, so they couldn't take Zhao's picture. I mean, it was like, high school behavior. Deng Xiaoping was the supreme leader. He would make the ultimate decisions, but he wasn't. He was like an emperor who didn't really know necessarily what was going on. So the rival factions would rush to try to get to him first and kind of spin events in their way, and then he would make a pronouncement, oracle-like, that everybody was supposed to line up. And sometimes Zhao would get to him and say, look, things are fine, don't worry. Sometimes Li Peng would get to him and say, the state is under threat, our entire system is under threat, we have to crack down. And so, this is no way to run a government. I mean, it was not a kind of, the person making the decision did not seem to have a lot of unbiased information at his fingertips from which to decide. I mean, it was very chaotic. People have used the term mafia-like. That's maybe a little rough, but the idea of Deng as a kind of godfather figure, with his lieutenants sort of running around and executing this and that they think is on his behalf, and spinning events for him to then make these emperor-like pronouncements, it's not entirely wrong. I mean, he hadn't actually broken any laws, probably, but even by Chinese standards. But and in earlier purges, certainly during Mao's times, people who challenged the official line were treated far more harshly. I think they made a calculation that the crackdown in 1989 was so severe, it really plunged China into darkness for a few years before kind of reforms and the economy started moving again. I think the crackdown was so severe, the Chinese government, had a sense pretty quickly they had control over society, they had control over propaganda, and they didn't need to fear Zhao. They could keep him under house arrest. I mean, in his book, it's almost comical, certainly Kafkaesque, as he describes attempts to get out from time to time, to play golf, and he's at one point he wanted to play pool at the pool hall where the old party officials go? And they said no, they said no, they said no. And he said, how can you say no? They finally let him go, but before he went, they cleared the place of every single person. So Zhao's going out to play pool with his friends. He's in this giant, club all by himself with a pool cue and some balls. So they succeeded in making him a non-person, and that's what was important, without making him a martyr, which is what might have happened if they jailed him or treated him more harshly. So, to be honest, in terms of what Beijing wanted to do, basically to erase his memory, they succeeded just fine the way they treated him. Until now that suddenly, out of nowhere, unexpected, this memoir has come out where, speaking from the grave, Zhao is when this news broke, the Wall Street Journal ran an op-ed piece that the headline was Zhao Ziyang's Revenge. And it is kind of, he is having the last word on what happened back then. Since the publication, the Chinese government has also similarly tried to kind of react calmly. And they're not coming out and denouncing this. There's been very little. There was one sort of indirect kind of an editorial that ran in some Hong Kong papers that was clearly officially approved, but it mostly criticized Western media response to the book rather than taking on any of the book itself or Zhao himself or the contents of the book. So I think they're trying to not inflame things. The family has made it clear that the tapes are real, that the book is real, that they're behind the publication, but they're trying to lay low, and the government, as far as I know, hasn't made life worse for them since the publication. I think the political reform question is unresolved. Because it's unresolved, it means that there is a kind of bottled up pressure that if the government can somehow handle it and finesse this kind of unresolved question, great, and it will continue forever. I doubt they can. The movement 20 years ago was very unexpected. People marched because of the death of a Communist Party general secretary. I mean, you wouldn't have predicted that. And yet suddenly you had more than 1 million people on the street, and not just in Beijing, all across the country. I mean, this was truly a national movement. So you don't know what might trigger something like that. But I think something will. Not even necessarily mass unrest, but just a movement for political freedom, for a kind of a modernization of the political system to accommodate the modernization in the economy. I don't think those yearnings go away. The economic development has been so successful that most Chinese are not demanding political reform. They're not really thinking about that. But particularly if the economy goes sour, if the kind of rising expectations that have been built into society because of the economic growth suddenly are dashed, and people are really worried about whatever it is, a slowdown in growth, lost jobs, higher prices, corruption, then that can feed into a sort of political discontent. And at some point these issues have to be resolved. And I think hopefully that can happen without a crisis. But the tighter the control on political freedom now, in my mind, the more it's likely to erupt in crisis when it does emerge. I'm not saying China hasn't improved in 20 years. It has. There are more NGOs operating. There are some important things that are happening that are not controlled by the Communist Party now at a certain level. There's probably more transparency in the process. 20 years ago, you had Deng Xiaoping, you had a generation of kind of revolutionary veterans who didn't have official titles but essentially ran the country. That's not a healthy situation. That's not a kind of a transparent, accountable government. So you have a more normal government structure. It's not particularly transparent. We don't really know what happens behind the scenes, but it has all improved. Yeah. The model so far, a great deal of economic freedom and very little political freedom. You'd have to look at it and say, that seems to work. They have a long way to go. I mean, the Chinese economy, I would say, is partially reformed. I think, to sort of keep going, They need to free up a lot of people to move around, to have freedom to kind of do what they want, to employ themselves when they want, to take all kinds of risks, to enter aspects of the economy that are closed off to them. So I think there needs to be kind of further reform. I don't know if that's political or economic at that point. I just think you have a kind of a built-in time bomb that if you don't allow people to let off political steam, it builds up, and it could build up in a way that even threatens the kind of stability. And I mean, what the Chinese government says is by clamping down, we ensure stability, and stability allows the economy to grow. But I think that works up to a point, and if you keep people down, you've essentially created an instability. It's just a question of when and how that will erupt. This book cannot be sold in China. There's no way. However, there is a Chinese language version that was printed in Hong Kong, and we know that people from mainland China who visit Hong Kong are stuffing their suitcases with it. It's sort of sold out in the airports, and they sort of stuff their suitcases with it before they go back. But probably more importantly, somebody scanned in a PDF version, which is up on a file server, and it looks like it's being downloaded all over China. So the Chinese language of this book is being read by anybody who cares about it. So again, it becomes part of the dialogue inside China. Simon & Schuster was the publisher of the U.S. edition and controlled the foreign rights, and they're actually thrilled. I mean, normally they probably wouldn't say it publicly, so I'll have to say it for them. But nobody was going to buy the book in China. It wasn't going to be sold. So the idea that it is actually getting out there, even if it's, the idea of PDF version of books circulating normally is terrifying for a publisher. In this case, I think they're pretty happy about it. Back in 1989, the student protest, there were very few protests then, and any protest was a huge deal, and the government would have to confront: do we crack down? Can we make it go away? Do we start arresting people immediately? And they were rare events, and they required a kind of dramatic response. Now there are tens of thousands of protests across China all the time, and they've probably accelerated during the sort of recessionary period, and they tend to be workers and farmers, people who have kind of, probably workers mostly, who have small-scale issues, localized issues about factory conditions, about layoffs, things like that. And the government has managed to handle those. That they realize, okay, this is going to happen, but that doesn't fundamentally threaten the state. I mean, when it's kind of when the intellectuals, when the elite take to the streets, that then becomes a problem. But there is concern. China has a big stimulus package of its own that seems to be working. China has been hit. I think exports are down 25%. I mean, it's a huge figure. That represents a lot of money. That represents a lot of factory closures. Although still, compared to the hit that the U.S. has taken, they seem to be surviving relatively well.